Today I am doing an advanced tanking guide. This is an update to my other tanking video. If you haven't seen it, I touch base a little bit more on the basics in that video, but I will kind of recap some of those thoughts that I had here, as well as add a few updated points from that video. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. To begin, before I forget, in the other tanking guide I made, I advised people to buy Grit Ward on their armor, and I will say that that is no longer my recommendation. Instead, what I would recommend as being the primary perk that you need on each of your pieces of gear is definitely health, as well as Enchanted Ward. Those are kind of the two almost mandatory that I would say you need to have on as many pieces of gear as possible. And of course, once you get better at tanking and you understand your build, you can modify it, take it off of some pieces of gear. You'll see that on this one, I still have health, but I also threw on there some strike conditioning. I don't exactly like Empowering Breaker. I'll probably replace this piece at some point, but I wanted to add a little bit more conditioning for my build. So I sacrificed to get that strike conditioning. And then in addition on, let's say this piece, I wanted some vigor to be able to reduce burn, bleed, and poison. So I put that on there. And then of course, Invigorate is good as well to reduce weaken, diseases, exhaust, and rend. But I'm still rocking that Enchanted Ward and health. So as far as it goes for gear, if you are fresh jumping into 65 or you are looking to break into those best in slot gear pieces, Enchanted Ward and health are almost a minimum requirement for each of your pieces of gear. And then that third slot, you should rotate it around for a few conditionings: slash, thrust, and strike. You should also have a couple pieces of gear with refreshing on. This will decrease your overall cooldowns, and trying to hit that stack of 4 out of 4 is very ideal. So when you first hit 65, or if you're looking to take on tanking, I always recommend that people come over into the armor section. Go ahead and sort by the highest gear score possible, and then go into the filters to refine down. I definitely recommend at least getting health as well as Enchanted Ward on your piece of gear. Select only selected perks so you know you're at least getting those two pieces, and refine it. And then try to buy a few pieces that don't break the bank unless you have the money to do so, that at least have Enchanted Ward and health on. If you're able to get a couple perks in accordance with the weapons that you are using, then by all means do so there, but at least buy what is most affordable and best to be able to get you started. Do note that you can probably go down to at least 675 on your gear score. And the main reason I say that is because once you dip down below 675, you are no longer able to do M2 expeditions. Your M3s are going to require 695, so you can work your way up to that if needed, but at least getting into 675 would be the first recommendation I have. You can automatically queue for M1s and M2s on your random dailies, as well as just going in here and selecting to automatically queue in. So M1s and M2s are 675, so definitely keep it above 675 when you're buying your gear. Coming in here and buying a specific piece of gear, for example, these boots, which have health, Enchanted Ward, and slashing conditioning for 2000, and it is a 685 gear score item. That's pretty good. It's also got strength and con, which is good for most tanks. You've got a breastplate for 4000, 31 strength, 698 gear score, and it's got Enchanted Ward, health, and empowering leaping strike, which is not the best, but even if you're not using Leaping Strike, you're at least getting two key perks for you. While we're here in the shop, before we move over to some advice I'll give you on the vendor to clear out your build as well, this would be a good time to come in here to the refined resources, cut gemstones, and go ahead and go all the way down to the bottom. Make sure you clear out all your filters, otherwise you won't see anything. And at this point, for most of your gear, you should be buying either Onyx or Opals. In my current build, I've pretty much maxed out all Opals, but Onyx aren't bad either. As far as your weapons, you'll most likely be buying some Carnelian gems, but there is a way to get around the need for this, and we'll cover that here in just a moment with your artifacts. But once you have those, you can also come over and buy a couple of the consumables, but we'll touch base on those here in a minute as well. In order to clear out the rest of your build, I would recommend you come over to the faction vendor. Hopefully you are maxed out. If not, then try to work on that. But once you come in here to the reward section and you go down to the last area, you'll see 3 different sets of armor, both for light, medium, and heavy. Of course, you're most likely going to be buying the heavy as a tank, but you'll already see right here, Enchanted Ward, Health, and Refreshing on each of these pieces of gear. All of them have the exact same. They also come with Constitution, but you can change that to Strength if you need to, and I'll cover that here in a moment. But Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, and Health right off the bat, you'll see that each piece does cost a substantial amount of gold as well as faction tokens. So I definitely recommend using this as a last resort. You'll also see that they come in at 675 gear score. So if you're looking to use these temporarily until you get higher gear score items, it's not bad. It's what I did when the server first released. And eventually you can either buy or obtain better pieces that can take you into the closer to 700 range, so you can do M3s. But for now, good start with these. And Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, and Health starts you off really great. Again, don't use more than 4 of them unless you have to, because then at that point, Refreshing does not receive more benefits. But if you're watching the video right now, what I would recommend you do is buy the helmet, gloves, pants, boots, and start with those 4. And then you're going to go ahead and come into the activities tab, and you should go ahead and queue in for barnacles and black powder and run this as an M1 mutation a couple times until you are able to get the Void Dark Plate to drop. This comes with Enchanted Ward, Physical Aversion, and Health, 3 very key stats in addition to Dark Reinforced, which gives you 20% extra armor. So at this point, after you pick up the 4 faction pieces and the Void Dark Plate, you'll have all of your armor slots minus your shield taken up. As far as it goes for the shield, I recommend using a tower shield. And then of course for this one, I mainly like sturdy on this tower shield. Giving me that strike shield ward is not bad, as well as refreshing. I needed to be able to put it on this piece because I don't have it on my others. And shield defense is not bad. Definitely could have a better piece, but for me, I think this is fine for now. Jumping over to the weapons, I hear a lot of people talk about using the Tai longsword, but I've been using Butcher lately and really enjoying using this blade. So that is the sword that I've been running. And then we'll get into the secondaries and their attributes here in a little bit, but I consistently find that I always come back to a hammer, and that is because of the amount of crowd control that you can put out with this. So find a secondary weapon that you enjoy. I do recommend the hammer, but anything will work. As far as the heart rune, it's pretty much uncontested that tanks should be running stone form. I think there is an argument for vines in other regards, but heart form is really the one that you should be running, especially when you can run it with a lot of other heart rune based stats on your jewelry. For instance, on my ring, I have Purifying Heart, and as soon as I use my heart rune, I lose all debuffs. So if I happen to find myself in a situation where I have a bunch of debuffs on myself, I can pop my heart rune and immediately cleanse myself of those, in addition to giving myself Fortify. So if I get really in a pinch, I can pop the heart rune, cleanse myself of all the debuffs, and immediately trigger Fortify. As far as it goes for jewelry, I think there's a lot of ways that you can run the jewelry. I think running Refreshing on jewelry can be a waste, and usually I would recommend against it. Of course, in this situation, I just needed to run Refreshing because I was running some other perks on my other armor. But having leeching on the ring is really good. But again, run whatever you feel comfortable on these. The big one that usually is debated is the amulet. And that is because your amulet is the piece of gear that you can use to be able to give yourself a lot of resistances. So let's take this Iceproof Exemplary Amulet of the Soldier, for instance, and you'll see that I have Frozen Protection on it. And then I've also thrown a cut gem on there that gives me additional ice damage absorption. If I were running Glacial Tarn M3, I would be throwing this piece of gear on hands down. If I was running an expedition that instead had a fire damage boost to it for one of its mutations, I might throw this amulet on. Of course, when you're running an M1 or an M2, that's not usually a concern. It's usually a concern when you're running M3 because the amount of damage output is just so ridiculous on M3s. And for the most part, I would recommend you run the Lost Stopwatch as your artifact in your jewelry. The reason why is because you now don't need to run a Carnelian gem in either of your weapons if you don't want to, because your taunts are active and you generate more threat through the main perk. Of course, this amulet does drop from the depths from Commander Thorpe, so if that is not in a current mutation rotation, then you might need to run something else in the meantime, and you might need to run Carnelian gems on your weapon. But if you are able to get this, or you already have it, then Lost Stopwatch is definitely what you should be running. It also gives you health, and refreshing recovery is really good for in a pinch, where as soon as your health drops below 50, all of your active abilities are brought back up. In addition, Purify is not too bad. You get to lose all of your debuffs if you are hit while below 50% health, which is another way that you can kind of be able to cleanse yourself of debuffs if you're in a pinch. So the Lost Stopwatch is a phenomenal piece of jewelry to run as a tank. In addition to the Void Dark Plate, it can really change a build. As far as your weapon, again, choose whichever one you like, and you don't even have to run an artifact if you don't want to. When it comes to consumables, I think running a Honing Stone is not bad if you're looking to increase your overall damage. The Incense is not bad for being able to increase your resistances. And then popping an Oak Flesh Balm or a Gemstone Dust for either elemental or physical damage when you're in a pinch is not bad either. The main consumable that I recommend is Attribute Food. We'll get into attributes in a second, but I usually carry around something to be able to increase my strength, something to be able to increase my constitution, and then something to be able to increase my focus. And the focus one is a relatively new thing that I've been bringing, but being able to increase my focus by 48, which with the base 5 that every stat gets, gives me 53. And if we jump in here to the attributes, you'll notice that with 53, I am immediately able to get 10% increase to incoming healing, all incoming healing. I'm still tinkering around with this, but lately I've been running it and it feels pretty good that in group content such as expeditions or group PvP, getting an additional 10% healing from my healer, I really enjoy. So popping that 48 extra focus is really nice. But as far as the attribute split normally goes, there are a lot of different ways that you can do this split, and there are plenty of arguments around on the internet for which way you should go. But I believe almost unanimously that most new tanks, or even for a general tank build, 300 con is the minimum that you should run. You should then throw all of the rest of your attribute points into strength, and that's about the standard of what people recommend. If you start getting a little more comfortable in your tanking, then I have seen people bring this down to about 200 on Constitution, and then bring up your dexterity to about 150 to be able to increase your dots, as well as getting a 5% increase to your damage while your health is full, and then a 5% increase in damage when your stamina is not full. So hitting that 150 on dex is good, and then dump the rest into strength. Get it as high as you possibly can go, which for this, you should easily be able to get about 200 into con, 150 into dexterity, and then with your food buff you can take your strength over 250, probably around 260, 270 pretty easily. And that's with having a gear score of around 700, so you're receiving the maximum benefit from those stat increases from your armor. If you're able to take that over 700, then that can just go even higher. But again, circling back around, most of the time I would recommend the general tank build to have about 300 con and as much strength as you possibly can have, which in this situation I can have 300 con, 273 strength, and as soon as I pop one of those food buffs, I'm now into the 300 plus on strength as well. So 300 con, 300 strength is kind of the standard build there. I would say go with that until you feel more comfortable. Jumping into weapon masteries, most people are going to run Sword and Shield as their primary weapon. And of course, they can default to using Flail and Shield as the primary if they want to run that instead. As far as it goes for secondaries, most tanks I see go for a Warhammer because of the amount of crowd control that it can dish out. But if you're looking to do more damage, Spear and Greatsword are wonderful secondary options instead. I have seen Blunderbuss and Great Axe being a secondary option as well. And then way down in the list, although I get a lot of comments of people saying it on my last tank video, that Hatchet is a preferred choice as well. Of course, I don't like it but by all means, try it if you want. Running into each of them real quick, I'll show you the current builds that I'm going for on each of these. Take them with a grain of salt, or just, you know, as a good starting point. I tinker around with my points a lot and do a lot of testing. So at any given time, the current one that I might be running may not be the best. Of course, a lot of people like to take defensive formation, but leadership is kind of what I've been going for lately to be able to provide more damage for my team. But if you want, just go ahead and screenshot each of them. There's my sword and shield build. This is my current flail build. This is my current spear build, and I've been testing out sweep a lot lately. I know that sometimes people will take another perk instead of sweep. I believe cyclone is one that I've seen online, but I really enjoy sweep, so I've been going with that. Here's the great axe build. Here is my great sword current build going into the Defiance tree predominantly, which I think is kind of predictable there for a tank. Although if you're looking to be a little more offensive and do a little bit more damage, I'm sure Onslaught is probably a much better tree. I haven't finished out my hatchet build, but if I were to have the other 3 points, I would probably finish out this tree right here, as well as maybe throwing in exploitation. And that is because with our sword and the butcher, we should be able to put bleed onto people pretty reliably. So being able to do an additional 10% damage to people that have an active debuff is not bad. But that is my current hatchet build. I'm not going to show a blunderbuss build, and that's because I'm still working on it and I wouldn't even know what points to recommend right now with that. But last but not least is our Warhammer build. And I seem to go back and forth between having Armor Breaker and running the Mighty Gavel or Path of Destiny, but currently I'm running Armor Breaker and having a pretty good time with it. So take this build if you'd like it. Otherwise, any of these builds, you can look them up online and probably find a good build guide for those. In the last video, we touched up on iframes, so I don't really think I need to get too much into those, but it's always a good idea to practice against enemies with an easy attack so that you can practice your iframes. But as you run each of these expeditions over and over, you'll get more proficient at the attack pattern of the bosses and being able to dodge through. Of course, if you're running the wall, which is currently on rotation as well, if you're watching this video within the first few days of it being released, the wall is on rotation. So picking up the wall and the Void Dark Plate are feasible right now. You do miss out on your dodge while running the wall, but there's a good argument for running that instead of Void Dark Plate. And if you want to give that a try, go ahead. But practicing your iframes is always a good idea. And then the more you know the bosses, the better. Of course, my last tip is on attack patterns. And what I would say is most of the time when I'm running an expedition or doing group content, I will have my shield up. And as soon as a enemy hits my shield, I'll immediately follow it up with a heavy attack. And that's because most enemies will do 1 or 2 attacks and then take a break, so you're able to heavy attack in that lull. And what this does is it generates the most threat possible. By blocking an attack, you are generating a substantial amount of threat with that enemy. And then by throwing in a heavy attack, you are generating another huge amount of threat with that enemy. They redid threat with the Eternum release, and currently standing, blocking attacks and doing a heavy attack are some of the top ways to generate threat. So making sure that you're doing that every once in a while, especially if you have a Carnelian gem or some other way to generate more threat, is a phenomenal way to be able to maintain aggro on your enemies. So make sure you are doing that, blocking the attack and then throwing in a heavy attack and then going right back into blocking. And throwing that heavy attack not only generates threat, but it also gives you a chance to recover your stamina. And I think eventually, aside from dodging for iframes or dodging substantially heavy attacks from bosses, most of the time I recommend you not dodge, because that is going to drain a huge amount of your stamina bar and will put you in a position where if you try to block one of the next attacks, it'll immediately stagger you. And guys, that is all I have as far as it goes for the tank build. A little bit of an update on the last one. If you found it at all useful, I would greatly appreciate if you did all that normal YouTube stuff. Aside from that, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.